She steps onto the pages of the Bible wrapped in gold, trailing spices, and leading a massive caravan across the brutal sands of the ancient Near East. Most people know her simply as a wealthy monarch, a foreign dignitary who came to Jerusalem to secure a trade agreement, a passing historical footnote meant only to highlight the vast wealth of King Solomon. But read the opening of 1 Kings chapter 10 carefully, and a very different picture emerges. She did not cross 1,000 miles of desert just to look at gold. She already had gold. Her kingdom was one of the most lucrative spice trading empires in the ancient world. She did not need Solomon's money. The text tells us exactly why she came, and it reveals a detail that changes how we read this entire encounter. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 1, says that when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. That phrase, hard questions, is where the mystery begins. The Hebrew word used here is chidot. It means riddles, dark sayings, complex, tangled problems. It is not a word used for standard political negotiations, border disputes, or tax treaties. It is a word used for deep, philosophical, and spiritual knots of human existence. It is the language of ancient wisdom literature. The Queen of Sheba is not arriving merely as a politician. She is arriving as a seeker. Think about the physical reality of this event. The journey from Sheba, located in what is likely modern-day Yemen, to Jerusalem was agonizing. It was a perilous, months-long trek through an unforgiving wilderness. It required massive resources, protection from bandits, and intense physical endurance. A sovereign ruler does not leave her throne and make that kind of journey merely to satisfy idle curiosity. She was a woman who possessed almost unimaginable earthly power and luxury, yet she was deeply hungry for something her wealth could not buy. She was searching for order, for meaning, for wisdom that actually worked. And notice the specific trigger for her journey. The biblical text explicitly notes that she heard of Solomon's fame concerning the name of the Lord. This is the crucial detail. She had heard rumors not just of a clever human king, but of a king whose wisdom was directly connected to a specific deity, to Yahweh, the God of Israel. This detail shifts the entire narrative. The story of the Queen of Sheba is not a random historical interruption in the book of 1 Kings. It is a profound theological marker. It represents a brief, shining moment in biblical history, where the nations of the world were drawn out of the dark and into the light of Israel's God. Her arrival establishes a prophetic pattern of the Gentile world seeking true, divine wisdom. It is a pattern that echoes backward to the ancient promises made to Abraham, and it is a pattern that echoes forward, ultimately pointing to the birth and ministry of Jesus himself. She brought the deepest riddles of the human heart to the throne in Jerusalem. But to understand the riddles she brought and the absolute shock she experienced when she arrived, we have to understand the environment she was walking into. She was not just entering a wealthy capital city. She was walking into an architectural and spiritual masterpiece designed to send a very specific message to the surrounding nations. What exactly was she testing? And why was the rumor of Solomon so powerful that it pulled a queen out of the desert? To understand her questions, we have to look at what Solomon had actually built. To understand what the Queen of Sheba saw when she arrived, we have to erase our modern ideas of what a royal capital looks like. Jerusalem, in the days of King Solomon, was not just a fortress of stone and military power. It was designed to look like a garden. Specifically, it was designed to echo the Garden of Eden. If you read the descriptions of Solomon's building projects in 1 Kings chapter 6 and chapter 7, a distinct pattern emerges. The temple and the palace complex were saturated with botanical imagery. The walls were carved with gourds and open flowers. The pillars were shaped like palm trees and covered in hundreds of sculpted pomegranates. The great bronze basin used for washing was resting on the backs of 12 bronze oxen, and its brim was shaped like the cup of a lily. Even the inside of the temple was completely covered in cedar. The text explicitly notes that no stone was seen. When you walked into the center of Israelite worship, you were meant to feel as though you had walked back into the original, unfallen garden. You were standing in a miniature model of the cosmos, a place where heaven and earth overlapped perfectly. But the Eden imagery did not stop with the architecture. It extended to the king himself. Listen to how the Bible describes the wisdom of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 33. It says, "He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds, and of reptiles, and of fish." Why does the biblical writer give us a list of biology? Why emphasize trees, beasts, birds, and creeping things? Because the writer is deliberately pointing us back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God brought the animals to Adam to name them, to classify them, to understand them, and to rule over them wisely. Adam was tasked with maintaining the order of the garden. Here, the biblical text is showing us that Solomon is functioning as a new Adam. He is a king who possesses the wisdom to properly order creation. And because the king had wisdom, the nation had peace. 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us that during Solomon's reign, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. And it says that every man lived safely under his vine and under his fig tree all the days of Solomon. That is a picture of paradise restored, a kingdom at total rest. No wars, no famine, no chaos. This is the rumor that leaked out into the ancient Near East. Caravans and merchants were not just bringing back stories of a rich king in the hills of Canaan. They were bringing back reports of a kingdom that seemed to have solved the human problem. A kingdom where the curse of Genesis chapter 3 seemed to be momentarily lifted. A kingdom ruled by a man who had tapped into the divine wisdom of the Creator. And so, the Queen of Sheba loaded her camels with spices, precious stones, and a massive fortune of gold. She crossed the burning sands of the desert, risking everything, because she had to see if the rumor was true. She arrived in Jerusalem, ready to test this new Adam. She brought her riddles, her darkest questions, her most complicated political and philosophical knots, to see if his wisdom was real. But what happened next was entirely unexpected. When she finally sat down with the king, it was not the brilliance of his answers that ultimately shattered her. And it was not the sight of his gold that took her breath away. When the Queen of Sheba finally stands before King Solomon, the text gives us a surprisingly intimate detail about their meeting. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 2, says that she came to Solomon and spoke with him about all that was in her heart. This was not a brief diplomatic greeting. This was an unburdening. Think about the immense isolation of her position. As a sovereign ruler of a massive, wealthy empire, who could she talk to? Who could advise her? Every person around her was either a subordinate, a flatterer, or a political rival. She carried the weight of a nation, the complexities of human suffering, and the deep existential dread that comes from realizing that all the gold in the world cannot answer the darkest questions of the human soul. So she poured it all out. The Hebrew text implies an exhaustive questioning. She brought him the riddles, the tangled political knots, the moral dilemmas, and the spiritual mysteries that had haunted her. And 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 3, gives us the result. It says, Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. To understand the weight of this, we need to understand what the Bible actually means by wisdom. In the ancient Near East, kings often claimed to possess wisdom, but in the surrounding cultures, wisdom was usually associated with magic or hidden knowledge. It was the ability to manipulate the gods. It was the power to divine the future through secret rituals, or the ruthless cleverness to outmaneuver an enemy. Ancient Near Eastern wisdom was mostly about acquiring and keeping power. But the biblical concept of wisdom is fundamentally different. The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokhmah. While it can mean intelligence or understanding, at its root, chokhmah is about practical skill. In the book of Exodus, the craftsmen who build the wilderness tabernacle are said to be filled with chokhmah. They had the skill to take raw materials and arrange them into a beautiful, functioning order. That is the foundation of biblical wisdom. It is the applied skill of living in God's created order. It is the ability to see the moral and spiritual grain of the universe and live in alignment with it, rather than constantly tearing your hands apart by fighting against it. When Solomon answered her hard questions, he was not just giving her clever philosophical riddles in return. He was not reciting magical incantations. He was showing her the divine architecture of reality. Because his wisdom was a gift from Yahweh, Solomon was able to take the chaotic, confusing pieces of her life and her kingdom and show her how they were supposed to fit together. He was untangling the knots. He was bringing the peace of his Eden-like kingdom directly into her mind. For the first time in her life, this powerful Gentile queen was looking at the world through the lens of the God of Israel. The text tells us that she was entirely captivated. The answers he gave were flawless. They were deep, penetrating, and true. Most people stop right there. They assume the story is just a historical record proving that Solomon was the smartest man in the ancient world. But if we read carefully, a massive shift is about to happen in the text. As deeply as his words impacted her, his words are not what finally broke her. The biblical writer makes a point to show us that hearing the wisdom of Solomon was only the first step. When the conversation ended, she stepped out of the royal halls and simply looked around, and what she saw with her own eyes completely dismantled whatever composure she had left. Up to this point in the story, the Queen of Sheba has been listening. She has brought her hardest questions, and she has heard the wisdom of the king. But 1 Kings chapter 10 makes a deliberate shift. It moves from what she hears to what she sees. Verses 4 and 5 tell us that when the queen had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, her attention turned to the physical reality around her. The text lists exactly what she looked at. It mentions the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants and their clothing, his cupbearers. At first glance, this just sounds like a royal dinner party. It seems like a list of mundane catering details meant to show off his wealth. But remember the pattern of the garden. This is not a description of luxury. It is a portrait of perfect order. In her kingdom, and in every ancient empire of the time, royal courts were places of paranoia. They were filled with shifting alliances, the constant threat of assassination, poison, and chaos. Power was maintained by violence and fear. But as she looks around the court in Jerusalem, she does not see chaos. She sees a functioning ecosystem of absolute peace. Everything is in its right place. Everyone is provided for. There is no anxiety. It is the wisdom of God made visible in human society. And then, the list ends with one final, overwhelming detail. Depending on the translation you read, the text says she looked at the burnt offerings which he offered at the house of the Lord, or she looked at the magnificent stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. Whether it was the sacrifices he made or the physical ascent he walked to reach the temple, the focal point is exactly the same. She is watching his worship. She is watching the wealthiest, most brilliant human being she has ever met, humbling himself. She sees that his wisdom does not end with his own glory. It points upward. He submits his entire kingdom to a greater king. And when she sees this, the text says something incredible. Verse 5 ends with these words, "There was no more spirit in her." The Hebrew word, translated as spirit, is ruach. It is a massive, foundational word in the biblical text. It means breath, wind, or spirit. It is the same word used in the very first chapter of Genesis, when the Spirit of God hovered over the dark waters. It is the breath of life that animates human beings. To say there was no more ruach in her is an ancient idiom. In modern English, we might simply say it took her breath away, but the biblical meaning carries much more weight. When the ruach leaves someone in the Hebrew Bible, it signifies a total collapse. It means fainting. It means the body giving way. She is not just impressed. She is experiencing a profound, physical unraveling. Her entire worldview is coming undone. She realizes in a single moment that all of her gold, her massive spice empire, and her military caravans could never create the peace she is currently standing in. That kind of peace only comes from alignment with the Creator. She came to Jerusalem to test him, She arrived as a sovereign checking on a rival. She arrived with her guard up, armed with riddles and wealth. But looking at the peace of his kingdom and the reverence of his worship, her posture completely breaks. The testing is over. The defenses fall. The pride of a powerful Gentile monarch simply melts in the presence of God's ordered world. She is left completely breathless. She has found what she crossed the desert to find. But why does this specific moment matter so much? Why does her breathless reaction to Solomon echo across the rest of the Bible? Because her surrender was not just a personal realization. It was the sudden, shocking fulfillment of an ancient promise. To understand the sheer magnitude of her breathless reaction, we have to look past the immediate scene and look back at the origins of the biblical story. When the Queen of Sheba loses her spirit at the sight of Solomon's kingdom, it is not just a personal awakening, it is a cosmic shift. It is the sudden, beautiful realization of a promise God made centuries earlier. Go all the way back to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. God calls a man named Abraham out of the ancient world. He tells him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household. God makes a covenant with him, promising to make him into a great nation. But the promise had a specific goal. God tells Abraham that through his offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That is the vocation of Israel. They were not chosen to be an exclusive, isolated club that hoarded divine favor. They were chosen to be a conduit, a kingdom of priests, a light to the nations. They were meant to display the wisdom and justice of Yahweh so clearly that the rest of the world would see it and be drawn out of the darkness. But if you read the rest of the Old Testament up to this point, that is rarely what happens. For centuries, Israel's relationship with the surrounding nations was defined by conflict. They were enslaved by the empire of Egypt. They fought brutal wars with the Canaanites. They were oppressed by the Philistines. Even under the reign of King David, the surrounding nations were subdued through military force and bloodshed. The Gentile world was almost always a threat. The nations were the enemy. But now, look at the scene in 1 Kings chapter 10. The dynamic is completely inverted. The Queen of Sheba is not bringing an army to lay siege to Jerusalem. She is bringing a caravan of tribute. She is not mocking the God of Israel. She is actively seeking him out. The wealth of the nations is flowing into the city of God, not through violence, but through willing submission. And then, this pagan queen does something entirely unprecedented. She blesses Yahweh. Listen to her words in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 9. She says to Solomon, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness." Pause and look at what is happening here. A Gentile monarch from the very edges of the known world is standing in the courts of Jerusalem and openly declaring the eternal love of Yahweh. She recognizes that Solomon's throne is not the result of human luck. She sees that his authority was given to him by God for a specific purpose, not to conquer, but to execute justice and righteousness. The nations are finally looking at Israel and seeing God. The promise made to Abraham is happening in real time. The Queen of Sheba's visit is the high water mark of the Old Testament kingdom. It is the golden age. It is a brief, flawless picture of what it looks like when God's people actually live according to divine wisdom. It was the peak of Israel's history. But as anyone who reads the Bible knows, this golden era does not last. The peace will eventually shatter. Solomon's heart will turn away. The kingdom will fracture in two, and the people will eventually be sent into exile. The temple will burn. Yet, the image of the Queen of Sheba carrying her gold and spices out of the desert never fades from the biblical imagination. Even when the kingdom collapses, the memory of her visit remains. In fact, her arrival was not just a fulfillment of Israel's past. It was planting a seed for a massive future prophecy. The prophets would take this specific image and use it to describe the final rescue of the world. And hundreds of years later, that ancient prophecy would guide another group of wealthy foreigners out of the east. The golden age of Israel did not last. The kingdom fractured. The Temple of Solomon was eventually destroyed by Babylon. The descendants of Abraham were carried off into exile. The perfect peace that the Queen of Sheba witnessed became nothing more than a distant, painful memory. But the image of the Gentile nations bringing their wealth to the God of Israel did not die. It simply transformed. It moved from history into prophecy. Hundreds of years after the Queen of Sheba left Jerusalem, the prophet Isaiah looked into the future. He saw a day when God would finally restore his people and heal the broken world. In Isaiah chapter 60, he writes a stunning poem about the future glory of Zion. He says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come." Isaiah describes a future where the Gentile nations are once again drawn to the light of God, not through military conquest, but through willing submission. And to describe this future, Isaiah uses a very specific image. In verse 6, he writes, "A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord." That is not a random list of trade goods. Isaiah is deliberately reaching back into 1 Kings chapter 10. He is reminding the people of the Queen of Sheba. He is telling them, remember when the Queen of the South came out of the desert with camels, gold, and spices to bow before the wisdom of God? It is going to happen again. But next time, the king on the throne will be eternal. Now, turn the page to the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, a group of wealthy Gentile scholars, the Magi, arrive in Jerusalem from the east. They have crossed the ancient world, seeking the ultimate truth, and they are asking a very specific question. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. What do they bring with them? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Matthew is not just giving us historical details. He is showing us that the ancient pattern is repeating. The prophecy of Isaiah, which was built on the history of the Queen of Sheba, is finally coming to its ultimate fulfillment. The nations are once again seeking the true king. But notice the sharp, tragic contrast. When the Queen of Sheba came to Jerusalem, she found King Solomon sitting on a throne of ivory, surrounded by perfect peace, ready to answer her hardest questions. He was a king who possessed the divine wisdom of God. When the wise men arrive in Jerusalem, they do not find peace. They find King Herod, a paranoid, violent, illegitimate ruler who is terrified of losing his power. The leaders of Israel are corrupted. The religious scholars know the biblical prophecies, but they refuse to make the short journey to Bethlehem to see if they are true. The beautiful, ordered kingdom of Solomon is completely gone. So the star leads the Magi away from the royal palace. It leads them to a humble house. And there, the wealth of the nations, the gold and the spices, are laid at the feet of a child. The Magi, acting in the pattern of the Queen of Sheba, represent the Gentile world bowing down to the true king. They found the word of God made flesh. The pattern of foreigners seeking the light of Israel has successfully crossed into the New Testament. But the biblical use of the Queen of Sheba does not stop with the birth of Christ. When Jesus grows up and begins his public ministry, he reaches back into the Old Testament and uses the memory of this specific Gentile queen to do something absolutely shocking. The religious leaders of Israel are furious. They are standing face to face with Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12. They demand a sign. Jesus refuses to give them a cheap display of miraculous power to satisfy their skepticism. Instead, he gives them two historical warnings. First, he mentions the ancient prophet Jonah, and second, he brings up a woman, a Gentile monarch who lived 1,000 years earlier. Jesus looks at the religious elite and says, "The Queen of the South will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here." Notice exactly what Jesus is doing. He is taking the historical memory of the Queen of Sheba and holding it up as a mirror to the Pharisees. Look at the extreme contrast he draws. She was a Gentile. They are the chosen people of Israel. She traveled over 1,000 miles across a brutal, burning desert. God in human flesh walked directly into their towns, taught in their synagogues, and stood right in front of them. She only had a rumor of the truth. They had the living reality. She came with hard questions, willing to listen and humble herself before a foreign king. They came with hard hearts, armed with accusations, looking for a way to trap him and kill him. When she saw the wisdom of Solomon, the spirit left her. She surrendered her pride completely. When the Pharisees see the perfect wisdom of Jesus, they tighten their grip on their own power. This is a devastating critique. Jesus is telling the most highly educated Bible scholars of the first century that a pagan queen from the ancient world understood the value of divine wisdom better than they do. He elevates her from a historical footnote to a witness at the final judgment. The pure, unfiltered hunger for God found in this Gentile woman will stand as a testimony against religious complacency. But Jesus does not stop with the critique. He follows it with a statement that would have sounded like absolute blasphemy to a first-century Jewish ear. Something greater than Solomon is here. Think about what Solomon represented to the biblical mind. He was the peak, the golden age, the wisest man who ever lived, the builder of the first temple, the one who brought peace to the land. To claim to be greater than Solomon was to claim to be the ultimate king of the cosmos. But Jesus is entirely accurate. Solomon was a man who received divine wisdom. Jesus is the eternal wisdom of God made flesh. Solomon built a beautiful temple of cedar and stone that eventually burned to the ground. Jesus is the true temple, who would be destroyed on a Friday and rebuilt in 3 days on a Sunday. Solomon ruled over a temporary, fleeting Eden that fractured in the very next generation because his own heart turned away from Yahweh. Jesus is bringing an eternal kingdom that cannot be shaken because he is a king completely without sin. Solomon could answer the queen's hardest questions about life, politics, and suffering. Jesus is the answer to the deepest riddle of human existence. When the Queen of Sheba looked at King Solomon, she saw a beautiful but flawed, temporary shadow of what a righteous ruler should be. But when we look at Jesus, we are looking at the eternal substance. Christ does not just use her story to correct the hard hearts of the Pharisees. He uses her ancient journey out of the desert to reveal exactly what the entire human story is moving toward. Jesus said the Queen of the South would rise up at the judgment. When we understand the full weight of her story, we begin to see exactly why. Her journey is not just a passing historical event. It is the ultimate portrait of the human condition. We are all born into a world of riddles. We all carry dark, complicated questions about suffering, purpose, and order. And like the ancient empires, we constantly try to solve these riddles through our own power. We try to build enough wealth, secure enough safety, and gather enough influence to make the chaos go away. The Queen of Sheba had all of those things. She was at the absolute summit of human achievement. And yet, she still found herself staring into the desert, realizing that all the gold in the world could not heal the ache of the human soul. She had to seek a higher wisdom. She had to find the God of Israel. If you read the letters of the Apostle Paul, you will find the exact same language of wisdom and treasure that defined her ancient visit. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 3, Paul writes a profound summary of the Christian faith. He says that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Think about those two words together, treasure and wisdom. The Queen of Sheba brought immense physical treasure to Jerusalem in order to acquire wisdom. She traded gold for answers. She gave her wealth to hear the king speak. But Paul reveals that in the new covenant, the treasure and the wisdom are the exact same thing. You do not bring your wealth to buy the insight of Jesus. Christ himself is the wealth. He is the treasure. Solomon was a king who possessed wisdom. Jesus is the eternal wisdom of God. This changes how we read 1 Kings chapter 10. The story of the Queen of Sheba is a warning to anyone who thinks earthly success will bring them lasting peace. But it is also a beautiful, sweeping invitation. It shows us that God is not hiding. He is actively drawing the nations to himself. God places his light in the world so that those who are truly hungry will cross the wilderness to find it. And when you finally see it, when you finally look at the true king, the reaction is exactly the same as it was 3,000 years ago. It is not merely intellectual satisfaction. It is total surrender. Remember what happened to the queen. When she saw the perfect order of the kingdom, and when she saw the magnificent stairway by which the king went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. The breath left her lungs. The argument stopped. The testing was over. That is the final goal of biblical wisdom. Wisdom does not just organize your life or give you clever answers to your problems. True wisdom drops you to your knees in absolute awe of the Creator. It strips away your pride and leaves you breathless in the presence of God. If this deep dive into Scripture has helped you see the Bible with fresh eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next study. As you read the story of Solomon again, do not just see a historical record of a rich king and a foreign diplomat. See the deep, beautiful promise of redemption that echoes across the entire Bible. Her journey out of the desert was never just a political trade route. It was the pattern of the human heart, carrying its deepest riddles out of the dark, and finally finding its king.